It was a warm summer afternoon when Jasmine Williams, a young pregnant woman, was driving down a quiet street in her small town. She was only a few blocks from her home, heading to the grocery store to pick up a few things for dinner. Jasmine was tired, but excited to see her family later that evening. Little did she know, this simple drive would change her life forever. As she cruised down the road, she noticed a police car pulling up behind her, its lights flashing. She felt a little nervous, but she had done nothing wrong. She quickly pulled over to the side of the street and waited for the officer to approach her car. The officer, Mark Collins, walked up to her window. He was a middle-aged man with a stern look on his face. His uniform was neat, and his movements were confident, but there was something about his eyes that made Jasmine feel uneasy. "Good afternoon, ma'am. Do you know why I pulled you over?" Officer Collins asked in a sharp tone. Jasmine glanced at the speedometer and replied, "No, officer, I'm not sure. I was just driving normally." "Well, you didn't signal when you changed lanes back there." "That's a traffic violation," Collins said, pointing toward the road behind her. Jasmine felt her stomach twist. She hadn't realized she hadn't used her signal, but she wasn't sure why this was such a big deal. She was just trying to get home. Still, she stayed calm and replied, "I'm sorry, officer. I didn't mean to break the law." Instead of accepting her apology, Collins stepped back and glared at her. "What's your name?" he demanded, his voice getting harsher. Jasmine's heart began to race. "Jasmine Williams," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Williams, huh? I should have known," Collins muttered under his breath, though Jasmine couldn't tell if he was talking to her or to himself. There was something about his tone that felt colder than before. Feeling confused and uncomfortable, Jasmine just nodded, not understanding what was going on. The officer was making her feel like she was in trouble, even though she hadn't done anything wrong. "Step out of the car," Collins ordered suddenly, surprising her. Jasmine hesitated. "Why? I'm not sure what's going on here." "I said step out," Collins barked, this time with an angry edge to his voice. Jasmine took a deep breath. She knew she needed to stay calm, especially with her baby on the way. But the way Collins was acting made her feel unsafe. She slowly opened the door and stepped out of the car. As soon as she was standing next to him, he grabbed her by the arm, pulling her roughly. The action shocked her, and in that moment, fear flooded through her. But what happened next would change everything. Officer Collins swung his arm, and with no warning, struck Jasmine across the face. The force of the punch sent her stumbling backward, her hands reaching out to catch herself as she fell to the ground. Dazed and shocked, Jasmine barely registered what had just happened. Her head throbbed with pain, and she could taste the metallic tang of blood in her mouth. Tears blurred her vision, but she refused to let them fall. She was stunned, unable to comprehend the violence of the moment. Collins stood over her, his face expressionless, as if nothing unusual had occurred. Jasmine, trembling but determined, slowly got back to her feet. She was frightened, but she was also angry. How could this have happened? Why had this officer treated her like this? As she stood there, struggling to keep herself together, Jasmine had no idea that this incident was far from over. It was only the beginning of a much bigger story, one that would soon draw attention from far and wide, and change the course of her life forever. Jasmine's mind was spinning as she slowly got back into her car. The pain in her face was sharp, and the blood from her split lip made everything seem blurry. The once quiet street now felt much more dangerous. She couldn't believe what had just happened. Why had Officer Collins punched her? She wasn't a criminal. She was a pregnant woman, just trying to live her life. With trembling hands, Jasmine started the car and drove away. But she could hardly focus on the road. Her thoughts were all over the place, and every part of her body felt weak. She needed to get home, but she didn't even know if she was safe anymore. Her head hurt, and she could feel the anger building inside of her. This wasn't just a small mistake. This was wrong, and she knew she couldn't just forget it. Jasmine finally reached her house. It was a small, cozy home in the suburbs where she and her family had lived for years. As she parked in the driveway, she tried to breathe slowly, hoping the pain would go away. But the more she thought about what had happened, the more it hurt. She stepped out of the car carefully, holding her stomach as she felt the baby inside move. Jasmine's hand went to her face instinctively. She could feel the swelling where the officer had hit her. Her lips were sore, and her face felt hot. She didn't know what to do. Should she call the police? Should she go to the hospital? But she didn't feel safe anymore, not after what had just happened. She walked into the house, and her mother, who was sitting on the couch, looked up. "Jasmine, what happened?" Marcus Williams had always been there for his little sister, Jasmine. As the older brother, he had always taken on the role of protector, guiding her through life's challenges. He had seen Jasmine grow from a shy, quiet girl into a strong, independent woman. So when he received the phone call from their mother that evening, he knew something was seriously wrong. "Marcus, it's Jasmine. Something happened today. Something terrible," his mother said, her voice shaking with emotion. "What happened? Is she okay?" Marcus asked, immediately feeling a rush of concern. Jasmine was pulled over by a police officer. And, Marcus, he hit her. He punched her in the face for no reason. His mother's words came out in a rush. Marcus froze. His mind raced as he tried to process what he had just heard. Jasmine was his baby sister, the one he had always protected. The thought that someone would harm her, especially a police officer, filled him with a mix of shock and anger. He needed to get to her, to make sure she was all right, but he knew that this was bigger than just a physical injury. This was an issue of fairness, justice, and respect. Marcus had spent his whole life working to break down barriers, to fight against inequality, but now his own sister was the victim. "I'm on my way. Don't worry, Mom. I'll make sure Jasmine is okay," he reassured his mother. Marcus hung up the phone and immediately grabbed his coat. He had built a successful career over the years as a businessman, but more importantly, he had become an advocate for justice. He had spent years speaking out against unfair treatment, racial prejudice, and inequality. People listened to him. They respected him. And now, more than ever, he knew that it was time to step up for his sister. When Marcus arrived at his mother's house, he found Jasmine sitting quietly on the couch, still in shock. Her face was bruised, her lips swollen, but the hurt in her eyes was the hardest thing for him to see. "Jasmine, I'm so sorry this happened to you," Marcus said softly as he sat beside her. He gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "I don't know why he did it, Marcus," Jasmine whispered, her voice trembling. "I didn't do anything wrong. I was just driving. I didn't deserve this." "I know, sis," Marcus said, his voice full of warmth and determination. "But you're not alone in this. We're going to make sure this officer is held accountable. No one should treat you like that, especially not someone who is supposed to protect and serve." Jasmine looked up at her brother, his words filling her with a sense of hope she hadn't felt since the incident. She knew Marcus was a fighter, and if anyone could bring justice to her situation, it was him. Marcus reached for his phone and began to make calls. He contacted lawyers, activists, and influential leaders he knew through his work. He wasn't just going to let this go. He wasn't going to let the officer who had harmed his sister get away with it. The wheels were already turning in his mind. The case wasn't just about Jasmine. It was about making a stand for everyone who had ever faced unfair treatment. Marcus made it clear that this wasn't just an isolated incident. He would make sure the world knew what happened to his sister, and he would make sure the officer was held accountable for his actions. He was ready to fight, not just for Jasmine, but for anyone who had been wronged by the system. Jasmine, feeling both scared and comforted by her brother's determination, knew that this wasn't the end of the story. In fact, it felt like the beginning of something bigger, something that would bring change. She just had to be brave enough to face it. The battle for justice was about to begin, and Marcus was going to lead the charge. The days after the incident passed slowly for Jasmine. Her bruises began to heal, but the emotional scars lingered. She found it hard to shake the image of Officer Collins standing over her, his face cold and unfeeling as he had struck her. She had always believed that police officers were there to protect and serve, but now she wasn't so sure. The trust she once had in the system had been shaken to its core. Marcus, on the other hand, was not wasting any time. After speaking with lawyers and activists, he knew that this was not just a personal attack on his sister. It was a bigger issue that needed to be addressed. Police brutality, racial profiling, and unfair treatment of black people were problems that had been ignored for too long. Now, Marcus was determined to make sure that Jasmine's case wasn't swept under the rug like so many others. The first step was to gather evidence. Marcus reached out to the people in the community who might have seen what happened. He contacted the driver of the car that had been behind Jasmine's during the traffic stop. The driver had been too far away to intervene, but he had seen enough to know that something was wrong. His statement, along with the nearby security footage from a local store, provided the key evidence Marcus needed. As Marcus continued his investigation, he began to speak out about what had happened. He used his platform to spread the word about his sister's experience. His business connections and reputation as an advocate for social justice made him a strong voice for change. He didn't just want justice for Jasmine. He wanted to bring attention to the larger issue of police misconduct. "I'm not going to stand by and let this go unnoticed," Marcus said at one of his public speeches. "My sister didn't deserve this, and neither does anyone else. We need to take a hard look at how we are treating each other in this country, and we need to make sure that those who are supposed to protect us are held accountable for their actions." The news about Jasmine's incident began to spread quickly. Soon, local news outlets were reporting on the story, and people from all over the city were reaching out to offer support. Many shared their own stories of unfair treatment at the hands of law enforcement. It became clear that Jasmine's case was not an isolated incident. It was part of a much bigger problem that needed attention. The protests began quietly at first, small groups of people holding signs and chanting for justice. But as the days passed, the movement grew larger. Marcus worked closely with local activists to organize peaceful demonstrations. He wanted to make sure the message was clear. They were not fighting violence with violence, but with a demand for fairness and accountability. Jasmine, who had once felt so alone and unsure about how to proceed, now felt a sense of strength she hadn't known before. She watched as her brother's words and actions brought people together. She saw that the pain she had felt was shared by many others, and together they were making their voices heard. Marcus wasn't just standing up for his sister. He was standing up for everyone who had ever been wronged by the system. And Jasmine, though still recovering from the trauma, felt a deep sense of gratitude toward her brother. She knew that what they were doing was bigger than her. It was about creating change for the future. The call for justice had begun, and it was louder than ever. While Marcus and Jasmine worked tirelessly to bring attention to what had happened, the focus on Officer Mark Collins was growing. At first, the news reports only mentioned his name and the incident involving Jasmine. But as time went on, more people started asking questions about the officer's history. It wasn't long before the investigation into Collins began to uncover some disturbing truths. Collins had been with the police department for over 15 years, and during that time, he had gained a reputation for being an aggressive officer. His interactions with people of color had raised concerns among his colleagues, but nothing had ever been done about it. Complaints had been filed against him before, but they were either ignored or dismissed. His behavior had never been fully investigated, and he had managed to continue his career without facing any real consequences. As Marcus and his team of lawyers dug deeper, they discovered a pattern of troubling behavior. Collins had been involved in several incidents over the years where he had used excessive force during routine traffic stops. He had even been accused of making racial remarks, though those claims were always dismissed or downplayed by his superiors. It seemed that Collins had learned how to protect himself, using his position of power to avoid accountability. Marcus was frustrated but not surprised. He had seen this kind of thing happen before. It was the same story with so many other officers who had a history of misconduct, but never seemed to face any real punishment. The system, he thought, was broken. And Jasmine's case was just another example of how people in power could abuse their position without fear of being held accountable. The more they learned about Colin's past, the more determined Marcus became to make sure this time would be different. He wasn't going to let Collins hide behind his badge any longer. He knew that exposing the officer's past could help build a stronger case against him, but it would also send a message to the public that this kind of behavior could no longer be ignored. Jasmine, though still recovering from the trauma of the incident, found herself growing more confident with each new piece of information that came to light. She had never imagined that Officer Collins had done this kind of thing before, and the fact that he had been allowed to continue his work without facing consequences made her even more determined to speak out. The news about Collins' past began to spread quickly. Soon, more people came forward with their own stories of negative encounters with him. They shared their experiences, and their voices added weight to the growing movement for justice. Jasmine wasn't alone in her fight. There were others who had faced similar mistreatment, and together they were demanding change. As the pressure on the police department mounted, it became clear that Officer Collins' actions could no longer be overlooked. The department had to act, and while the process of seeking justice was slow, Marcus and Jasmine knew that they were making a difference. They were not only fighting for Jasmine, but for everyone who had ever been mistreated and silenced. The wheels of justice were turning, and the truth about Officer Collins was finally coming to light. As Marcus and Jasmine continued to gather support for their cause, the investigation into Officer Collins grew more intense. Marcus knew that the key to getting justice for his sister wasn't just about bringing attention to the incident. It was about making sure the facts were clear and undeniable. They needed evidence, not just emotional testimony. Jasmine was still dealing with the physical and emotional toll of the incident, but she knew that she had to stay strong. She had already shared her side of the story, but now it was time for the truth to be uncovered in a way that would leave no room for doubt. Marcus quickly realized that the more people they could involve, the stronger their case would be. One of the first pieces of evidence that emerged was a video from a security camera at a nearby store. The camera had caught a portion of the traffic stop, and although it didn't show everything, it clearly showed Jasmine being pushed out of the car and struck by Officer Collins. The footage didn't lie. It was a clear visual confirmation of what Jasmine had been saying all along, and it sent shockwaves through the community. But that was just the beginning. Marcus and his team of lawyers began reaching out to people who lived in the area, hoping they might have witnessed the event. Several people came forward, including the driver of the car who had been behind Jasmine during the stop. The driver couldn't hear what was being said, but he saw enough to know that something was wrong. His statement added even more weight to the evidence. It wasn't just about one bad officer anymore. It was about exposing a pattern of wrongdoing, a problem that went far beyond what had happened to Jasmine. The community was rallying behind the idea that everyone, regardless of their background, deserved to be treated fairly, especially by those who were meant to protect them. While all of this was happening, Marcus was in constant contact with the media. He knew that the more attention they could bring to this case, the more pressure would be placed on the police department to act. He was careful, though, to make sure the message was clear. This wasn't about hatred toward law enforcement. This was about ensuring that officers who misused their power faced consequences. People began to speak out in support of Jasmine. A group of local activists organized peaceful rallies to demand accountability. The protests were calm and respectful, but their message was loud and clear. Justice for Jasmine, and justice for everyone who had been mistreated by officers like Collins. In the meantime, the internal investigation within the police department was slowly moving forward. But the pressure was on. With the growing public outcry, it became harder and harder for the department to pretend that nothing was wrong. The more evidence that surfaced, the more it became clear that Officer Collins could not just go back to his regular duties as if nothing had happened. Marcus knew that this wasn't going to be an easy fight. The system was slow, and the wheels of justice didn't always turn quickly. But he had the truth on his side, and that gave him the strength to keep going. He had made a promise to his sister, and to everyone else who had been treated unfairly, that he wouldn't stop until justice was served. The investigation was just beginning, and while the road ahead would be tough, Marcus and Jasmine were determined to see it through. The truth would come out, and Officer Collins would not be able to hide anymore. The tension in the city had reached its peak. Protests and rallies were happening almost every day, with people of all ages, races, and backgrounds coming together to support Jasmine and demand justice. Marcus had become the face of the movement, his voice strong and clear as he called for action. He wasn't just fighting for his sister. He was fighting for everyone who had ever been mistreated, silenced, or ignored. The pressure on the police department was building. The public was no longer willing to stand by and allow Officer Collins to keep his job after what had happened. Despite his past, despite the growing evidence, Collins still tried to defend himself. He claimed that the incident had been a misunderstanding, that he had acted in self-defense. But the video footage, the witness statements, and the growing support for Jasmine told a different story. Collins had no solid defense, and his attempt to justify his actions was falling apart. Behind the scenes, the investigation was moving forward. The police department had suspended Officer Collins while they conducted their internal review, but many people felt that this was not enough. They wanted more than just a suspension. They wanted him to face real consequences for his actions. Marcus had been relentless in his calls for criminal charges. It wasn't just about getting Collins off the force. It was about sending a message that officers who used excessive force would be held accountable, no matter their position or rank. Jasmine, while still shaken by the events, was growing stronger. She had come to realize that her story was bigger than just one unfortunate incident. It was a part of a much larger conversation about the treatment of Black people in the justice system and the ways in which power could be abused. She had become the face of this fight, even though it had all started with a simple traffic stop. She wanted to make sure that no one else had to go through what she had endured. Her strength became a source of inspiration for others who had also been hurt, ignored, or mistreated by those who were meant to protect them. The day of the public hearing finally arrived. The pressure was overwhelming, but Marcus was ready. He stood at the front of the room, his voice steady and firm as he spoke on behalf of his sister and everyone who had suffered due to police misconduct. Jasmine sat beside him, her hands trembling but her eyes full of resolve. She had never imagined that her story would grow into such a public fight, but now she knew it was the right thing to do. She wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for all the people who had been hurt and silenced for far too long. The room was packed with supporters, reporters, and officials. The media had been covering the case extensively, and the world was watching to see what would happen. Collins was there too, sitting at the back of the room, his face tense and anxious. His attempts to remain calm were failing. He knew that the spotlight was on him, and his past was catching up with him. Marcus began his speech with one simple message. This is not about revenge. This is about justice. This is about making sure that no one else has to go through what my sister went through. As he spoke, the room went silent, and people began to listen. They could feel the strength in his words, and they knew this was a turning point. This fight was not just about one person or one incident. It was about changing the system and making it fair for everyone. The showdown had arrived. The city was waiting for the decision that would change everything. Would Officer Collins face the consequences of his actions, or would the system fail yet again? The day of the trial had arrived, and the courtroom was filled with people eager to hear the final decision. The air was thick with tension as the case against Officer Mark Collins moved forward. Jasmine and Marcus sat side by side, their hearts heavy with anticipation. They had worked so hard to bring attention to this injustice, but now it all came down to this moment. Would they get the justice they had been fighting for? Jasmine couldn't help but feel a mixture of fear and hope. The memories of that horrible day still haunted her, but she knew she had to stay strong. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about holding the system accountable and ensuring that no one else would have to suffer like she did. As the trial began, the prosecutor presented the evidence, starting with the video footage from the security camera. The footage clearly showed Officer Collins using excessive force, pushing Jasmine out of the car, and striking her in the face. The room was silent as the video played, and it was clear to everyone in the courtroom that this was not a simple misunderstanding. This was an act of aggression that could not be ignored. Next, the witnesses were called to testify. The driver of the car behind Jasmine that day spoke up, confirming that he had seen Officer Collins treat Jasmine harshly, even though she had done nothing wrong. Other witnesses also came forward, sharing their accounts of past encounters with Collins that raised concerns about his behavior. The more they spoke, the clearer it became that Officer Collins had a history of inappropriate actions. Jasmine took the stand last. She was nervous, but she knew this was her chance to speak out for herself and for everyone else who had been hurt. With a steady voice, she described the events of that day, how she had been pulled over for a simple traffic stop, how she had tried to cooperate, and how, without warning, Officer Collins had struck her. She told the court how that moment had shaken her to her core and how it had affected her physically and emotionally. "I didn't deserve this," Jasmine said, her voice breaking. "I was just trying to get home. I didn't do anything wrong. I just want justice." The room was filled with emotion as Jasmine finished her testimony. Her words struck a chord with everyone present, and for the first time, it felt like people were truly listening to her. Now it was time for Officer Collins to defend himself. He took the stand and tried to explain his actions, claiming that he had been acting in self-defense. But his story was weak and full of holes. The evidence didn't match his version of events, and the more he spoke, the more people in the courtroom began to lose faith in his defense. His attempts to justify his behavior were falling apart. After hours of deliberation, the jury finally retired to make their decision. Jasmine and Marcus sat together, holding hands tightly. The waiting felt endless, but they knew they had done everything they could. They had presented the truth, and now it was up to the jury to decide whether justice would be served. Finally, the jury returned to the courtroom. The foreman stood up and read the verdict. The words they had all been waiting for echoed through the room. Officer Mark Collins was found guilty of assault. The relief that washed over Jasmine and Marcus was indescribable. They had won. It wasn't just a victory for them. It was a victory for everyone who had ever been wronged by the system. Officer Collins would face the consequences of his actions, and for the first time in a long while, Jasmine felt a sense of peace. The courtroom erupted in applause, and while the fight wasn't over, this was a huge step toward justice. The truth had prevailed, and Jasmine's bravery had made a difference. The verdict had been read, and the courtroom filled with an overwhelming sense of relief. The jury had found Officer Mark Collins guilty of assault, and the weight of the moment settled heavily on everyone present. Jasmine, still sitting with Marcus, felt a wave of emotions wash over her. She was exhausted, emotionally drained, but there was a sense of peace she hadn't felt in weeks. The justice she had fought for had finally been delivered. As they left the courtroom, Jasmine and Marcus were met with applause from supporters who had gathered outside. They had spent so much time fighting for this moment, and now the city was celebrating their victory. It wasn't just about one officer facing consequences. It was about standing up for what was right and making sure that others who had suffered would be heard too. Marcus looked at his sister and smiled, feeling proud of her strength throughout the entire ordeal. "You did it, Jasmine. We did it." Jasmine smiled weakly, her body still tired, but her spirit lifted. "We couldn't have done it without all the people who stood by us," she said, looking at the crowd outside the courthouse. "This is for them too." It had been a long road, and they knew that there was still much more to do. But for the first time in a long while, Jasmine felt hopeful. She realized that this case was just one small part of a much bigger movement for change. Her story had touched the hearts of many, and together they had proven that justice could be achieved, even in a world that often seemed broken. News of the trial spread quickly, reaching far beyond the small town where the incident had occurred. People from different cities and communities began to talk about the case. It wasn't just about one officer. It was about the ongoing fight against racial inequality and police misconduct. Jasmine's bravery had sparked a nationwide conversation about the need for reform in the justice system. But the journey wasn't over. While the guilty verdict was a step forward, Jasmine and Marcus knew that there were still many other voices that needed to be heard, many other injustices that needed to be addressed. They had become symbols of change, and with that came a responsibility to keep pushing for a better future. Marcus continued his work as an advocate for social justice, and Jasmine, though still healing from the trauma, found herself using her voice to speak out. She joined rallies, gave interviews, and supported other families who had faced similar challenges. She knew that by sharing her story, she could inspire others to stand up and demand the justice they deserved. The victory in court had been important, but the true success lay in the conversations it sparked, the hearts it opened, and the lasting impact it would have on the community. It was a reminder that change could happen, even in the face of adversity. For Jasmine, the road to justice had been difficult, but the reward was worth it. As she looked toward the future, she felt stronger than ever before. The fight for fairness wasn't over, but with her brother by her side and a community behind her, Jasmine knew they would continue to make a difference, one step at a time. And with that, the battle for justice moved forward, not just for Jasmine, but for everyone who had ever been silenced or wronged. The fight wasn't finished, but they had made sure that the world would listen.